There's many things I do that my children kind of get upset with me, or I don't know, let's say aggravated, whatever. I'm a dad. I tell dad jokes, and I don't know if it's bad jokes or dad jokes. It's kind of close, and I don't hear well. But some phrases that I use from time to time, I guess you could say kind of upset him because they can never figure that one out, right? And one of them is the other day. Now, when I say the other day, it could be 20 years ago. It could be last week. It could be any time, right? But it's the other day, right? So I'm not just trying not to be specific. So with that said, the other day I was at adoration when I was at St. Mary's, and I was sitting in the chapel, and it was just me and Jesus in the chapel that night. And my dad had been on my mind, I guess, pretty much that whole week for some reason. And I think I've told you all about my dad. I mean, my dad was, I guess sometimes you could say, not one of the greatest people of society. I mean, he was an alcoholic, and he smoked 3 to 4 packs of cigarettes a day, which he'd probably have to finance that today. But anyway, anyhow, my dad, all of his life that I remember, was an alcoholic. Now, he was a World War II veteran, and I've come to learn a lot about who he was and what had happened to him after the war. So a good friend of his told me that he wasn't the same person that came back, right? But I didn't find this out until long after he had passed. So I'm sitting in the chapel that night, and like I said, it was just Jesus and myself, and I told you all I cry for cartoons, so I was just sitting there and thinking about my dad and thinking about the life that I had growing up. Now I tell you all, him and I didn't go hunting, and I kind of held that as a grudge. I was not one of those kids that went to school on Monday and talked about the hunting trips with my dad on the weekend, right? That didn't happen. The only thing we did on Sunday afternoon most of the time was spend time at a bar room. Back then you could do that. You could bring your kids to the bar room. But that was the extent of my childhood, growing up with my dad, right? That was the time that we spent together. And I kind of I realized that I was holding a grudge because I didn't feel like I had the dad that I deserved. I didn't feel like that I had to, I could have had a better childhood, right? My dad could have done things with me. We could have had those adventures that all of my friends had talked about. But then God called me into working in hospice. And I started meeting veterans and starting to understand more about PTSD and the things that people had went through in the war, and knowing what this friend had said, that the guy who went to Europe was not the same one that came back. And that night in the chapel, the other day, I begged my dad for forgiveness. Because I realized that I might not have been the type of son that he really needed at that time in his life. That he was trying to drown these demons that had followed him back from the war, and it started out as that and became a disease of alcoholism, right? But not everything he did could have been his fault. But back then I was young and stupid, didn't know any better. I'm just older now, by the way. But I learned that not everything was in his control. And that night, like I said, in tears, I begged my dad for forgiveness. Now my dad he passed away about 30 years before that happened. And I begged him for forgiveness. When I walked out of the Adoration Chapel that night, I walked out, I felt like a free man. That I had freed myself from something that I had carried with me and didn't even realize that I was carrying it. But God had revealed that to me, and I needed to get rid of it. You see, because sometimes forgiveness is not always something that we receive and something that we give, but it's something that we have to learn to accept. And I asked my dad, like I said, on that night to forgive me, and I have felt free of that ever since. But you see, as Catholic Christians, we have to remember that the only thing we can take with us when we die is the things that we give away. I'm going to say that again. The only thing that we can take with us when we die are the things that we give away. You see, in today's gospel, and I mean, we've heard this gospel so many times, right? About this guy who goes in front of the king and there's no way he's going to pay it back and all of this kind of stuff, right? But just to give you an example of what this gospel is saying, right? And a little bit more in today's terms, right? So let's say this guy goes in front of the king because the king wants to settle accounts. And he owes the king $1 billion. And he has a part-time job making minimum wage. There is no way he can ever pay the king back what he owes him. Not in 10 lifetimes. So he begs, right? Must be a pretty good negotiator, right? That he could borrow that much on a part-time job. But he begs for forgiveness. And the king wipes away his debt. Right? So then he goes out and he meets up with one of his buddies who owes him $5. Now, you got to remember, you see, his whole mindset, everything he made before would have been paid toward the debt. Well, now he doesn't have the debt anymore. So now whatever I make is mine. Now I can kind of get my head above water or whatever, however it is. So we know the story, right? He chokes the other servant, puts him in jail till his debt is paid off and all of this. And when the king hears about it, he calls him back in and reinstates the debt. He has him beaten until he pays off the debt. Now remember, this was a debt, and the scripture actually says that a debt that he could not pay back. So you can only imagine what happened when they sent him to the torturers until he paid off the debt. And it's because he didn't have forgiveness in his heart, because he could not share what was given to him by the king with those that owed him. It's because he couldn't go out and share that same forgiveness, that same compassion that the king had just showed him. Now, why is Jesus telling us about this parable? You see, because Jesus knew where his life was going to end up. He knew that he was going to carry our sins on the cross to Calvary, and he was going to be crucified for us. You see, for the debt that we could never repay. They always said that salvation is not something that we can earn. It's something that's given to us by God. Our debt is wiped away by God because of the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made on the cross. Do we repay that in the same way that Jesus gave to us? You see, because we always look at forgiveness as something that we go and receive from someone, right? And we should. If we make a mistake, we should humble ourselves and go to that person. Or if we hurt someone or whatever it is, and we have to ask someone for forgiveness. That's a must. We should do it. I can tell you from personal experience, it's a freeing experience. But you see, forgiveness is not a reward for us when we realize that we did someone wrong and we ask for it. Forgiveness is a gift that each of us as a follower of Christ is to give away. Forgiveness is not the reward, it is the gift that we have to give. Forgiveness has to come from us, even if that person doesn't deserve it. We have to learn to forgive. Monsignor Leday told me one day, he said, forgiveness is a human act. Forgetting is an act of God. You see, we can forgive, we may not forget. We may never forget the pain that someone caused us, or the hurt, or whatever it is, or the insult, or whatever. But our job is to forgive. Because forgiveness is a gift. It's one of those things that we take with us when we die. Because we give it away. And we give it away freely. You see, and if we all learn to be forgiving people, if we all learn to be able to do that, just think of how much better the world would be, right? I used to say, I'm too lazy to carry a grudge. Because you have to do all the work. Another thing that I heard this week when I was preparing, it was like to hold a grudge against someone is like trying to take poison and hoping that the other person dies. Can you see how that compares to giving away forgiveness, right? If I forgive you, give away that forgiveness. If I forgive those people who hurt me, I become free. Because I no longer have to carry that weight. Jesus Christ gave us the greatest example of giving away that forgiveness. That forgiveness is that gift that comes from God. Because when he was on the cross, no one came to him and said, "We're sorry we did this to you." They scattered. His disciples scattered. The Romans were there. The Pharisees and all, they were all there watching, waiting for him to die. And he looked at them and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They didn't ask. He gave it away. And you see, if we can want to hold on to those things in our life that hurt us, we're not going to hear when we get to stand in front of the King, "Welcome, good and faithful servant." We're going to hear what the King said in today's gospel. "You wretched servant, shouldn't you have forgiven like I forgave you?" Can we learn to look at forgiveness as a gift that we give, not just as a reward that we want to receive? Because until we learn to give it away, we're going to have to carry it with us.